It was a bright morning at Harvard University, and the old lecture hall was already half full before the class even began. Students hurried to find their seats carrying coffee cups and heavy books, chatting about homework and weekend plans. The air buzzed with energy, but when the tall figure of Professor Raymond walked in, the noise died down almost instantly. He was known across campus for his sharp mind and his habit of surprising his students in unexpected ways. Some admired him, some feared him. Everyone respected him. The professor placed his worn leather briefcase on the desk and looked around the room, his sharp eyes scanning every face. "Good morning," he said in his deep voice. "Today we will try something different." His words made a few students exchange nervous looks. They knew that whenever he said something different, it usually meant trouble or brilliance, depending on how well you could keep up. In the back row sat a boy named Ethan. He was a quiet student who hardly spoke in class. Most people barely noticed him. He came from a small town, not like many of the others who had grown up in big cities or private schools. Ethan was on a scholarship, and he worked nights at the library to help pay for his expenses. He didn't wear fancy clothes or hang out with the louder groups, but his eyes were always watching, always thinking. That morning, Ethan sat with his notebook open, ready to take notes. He had learned that Professor Raymond liked to throw questions that made students argue or doubt themselves. Still, Ethan liked the class because it forced him to think in new ways. The professor was tough but fair. He had a strange way of teaching, more like testing the human mind than explaining theories. Professor Raymond slowly wrote something on the board. It was only one line, but the class leaned forward to read it. Then he turned and faced them. "This," he said, "is your question for today. You have 30 minutes to discuss it. At the end, I'll ask for your thoughts." The words on the board looked simple yet confusing. It said, "If truth can be bent by belief, is it still truth?" A soft murmur went through the class. Some smiled, thinking it would be easy. Others frowned, already lost. The professor sat down at his desk, folded his hands, and waited. The first to speak was a confident student from the front row named Daniel. He was one of those people who always had something to say. "Truth," he began loudly, "depends on perspective. What's true to one person might not be true to another." The professor didn't respond. He just nodded slightly. Another student, Lily, quickly added, "No, truth doesn't change with perspective. Belief can change, but truth stays the same. If you say the earth is flat, your belief doesn't make it true." Soon the room filled with voices. Some agreed with Daniel, others with Lily. One student argued that emotions could change what people accepted as truth. Another said that human perception was too weak to ever know the real truth. The debate grew louder, more competitive. Professor Raymond watched them with a calm smile. He loved watching students think they had the answer, only to realize they had missed something. His plan was working. He wanted them to feel unsure. He wanted to see how far they would go to defend their own logic. Ethan listened quietly. He didn't join the discussion. He wrote a few words in his notebook. Truth, belief, mirror. He kept thinking about how his father used to tell him, "The truth doesn't change, son. People do." Those words had always stayed with him. As the minutes passed, the classroom turned into a small battlefield of ideas. Daniel raised his hand again and said, "Professor, this is impossible to answer. You're tricking us." The professor leaned back in his chair, his lips forming a faint grin. "Maybe I am," he said softly. "Maybe the trick is the answer." The students laughed nervously. Ethan didn't laugh. He just stared at the board, his mind turning slowly. The professor's tone told him something important was hidden in the question. If truth could be bent by belief, it meant people had power over truth. But that couldn't be right. Truth was supposed to stand on its own. He thought about moments from his life when people believed in something false, and how belief alone didn't make it real. Like when people in his hometown used to spread rumors, and even if everyone believed them, they were still lies. So belief could be loud, but truth stayed quiet. The professor checked his watch. 5 minutes left, he announced. The students began wrapping up their arguments, each one still convinced they were right. Daniel looked back at Ethan and said jokingly, "Hey, quiet guy, what do you think?" "You haven't said a word all semester." A few people chuckled. Ethan gave a small smile but didn't answer. He wasn't shy. He just didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. He wrote one more line in his notebook. "Truth doesn't bend. It's people who twist their sight." The professor stood and clapped his hands once to get everyone's attention. "All right," he said. "You've all given interesting points. Now, does anyone believe they have the real answer?" Several hands went up immediately. One by one, the students explained their thoughts. Some used science, others philosophy, and a few even quoted famous thinkers. The professor listened carefully, occasionally nodding or asking a sharp question that left the speaker fumbling. When the last student finished, the room went quiet. The professor looked satisfied, but no one could tell what he was thinking. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote 3 words under the question, "What is constant?" Then he said, "Every answer I've heard depends on emotion, logic, or perspective. But none of you told me what remains unchanged." He paused and looked around the room. "Anyone?" No one spoke. Even Daniel stayed silent. The professor sighed softly and started to erase the board. Then a small voice from the back said, "Truth doesn't change. Only our view of it does." Every head turned toward the sound. It was Ethan. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady. The professor stopped erasing the board and turned to face him. "Go on," he said. Ethan stood up slowly, holding his notebook. "I think truth doesn't bend because it doesn't depend on belief. Belief is just what we see from where we stand. It can make us think truth has moved, but it's really us who moved. Truth stays where it is." The room was silent. Ethan looked down at his notes and continued. "It's like light through water. The light looks bent, but it isn't. The water just changes how we see it. Belief can do that to truth." He stopped talking. The silence grew heavier. The professor's eyes softened slightly as if something inside him had shifted. "Interesting," the professor said finally. "Very interesting." He walked closer, studying Ethan as though he had just seen him for the first time. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he replied quietly. "Well, Ethan," the professor said, "you've managed to say in a few words what most people spend a lifetime trying to understand." The other student sat quietly, unsure what to say. Daniel glanced down, embarrassed. Lily smiled faintly. The professor turned back to the board and wrote Ethan's words beside the question. "Truth doesn't bend. We do." He looked at the class again. "That's the point of the exercise. The question was never about philosophy alone, it was about perception. I wanted to see who would notice that the question itself was built on a false idea. Truth cannot be bent by belief, no matter how hard we try." Some students nodded slowly, realizing what had just happened. The trick question wasn't about finding the right theory. It was about seeing through the trap, and only one person had done that. The bell rang softly, but no one moved right away. The professor dismissed the class with a small wave of his hand, still deep in thought. As the students packed their bags, many stole glances at Ethan. He sat quietly, closing his notebook as if nothing special had happened. When everyone left, the professor walked over to him. "You see the world differently," he said quietly. "Don't ever lose that. The world needs more people who think before they speak." Ethan nodded politely and smiled. "Thank you, sir." As he walked out of the empty lecture hall, he felt a strange calmness inside. He didn't feel proud or victorious. He just felt understood, for the first time in a long time. Outside, the cold wind brushed against his face. Students were hurrying to their next classes, laughing and talking. Ethan blended into the crowd, the same quiet boy as before. But something had changed that day, something invisible yet powerful. He had spoken not to prove himself, but to speak the truth as he saw it. And sometimes, that was more than enough. The next week, the story of what happened in Professor Raymond's class spread quietly across the campus. It began as a whisper, someone telling a friend who told another friend, until it reached almost every student in the department. "Did you hear about the quiet boy who solved the professor's trick question?" They would say. Some told it with admiration, others with disbelief. A few even added their own version, claiming they had been there when it happened. Ethan didn't pay much attention to it. He still came to class early, sat in his usual seat at the back, and took notes in his old notebook. He wasn't looking for attention. To him, it had just been another day of learning, nothing more. But something in the classroom had changed. People who had ignored him before now greeted him politely. A few even tried to start conversations. Daniel, the loud student who had teased him, stopped making jokes at his expense. He still talked a lot, but whenever Ethan entered, his tone softened. Professor Raymond also seemed different. He no longer opened class with long lectures. Instead, he began asking questions that encouraged thought rather than competition. Sometimes, while explaining a complex idea, he would glance toward Ethan as if expecting him to say something meaningful again, but Ethan remained silent most days. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to understand. One afternoon after the class ended, the professor asked Ethan to stay behind. When the room was empty, he said, "You've made me rethink my own way of teaching." Ethan looked surprised. "Sir?" The professor smiled faintly. "I've spent years trying to challenge my students with impossible questions. I wanted to break their pride and make them think deeper. But maybe I forgot that sometimes wisdom doesn't shout, it listens." Ethan didn't know how to reply. He just nodded quietly. The professor continued, "You reminded me that understanding isn't about winning arguments. It's about seeing clearly. That's rare, Ethan. Don't lose that quality no matter where life takes you." Ethan thanked him and left the room, feeling both humbled and grateful. For the first time, he realized that his quiet nature wasn't a weakness. It was his strength. Over the next few days, the weather turned colder. Snow began to fall lightly on the campus lawns. The once green trees stood bare against the gray sky. Students hurried from one building to another, wrapped in scarves and thick coats. The library, where Ethan worked part-time, became a warm refuge from the cold. Ethan liked his job there. The soft rustle of pages, the smell of old books, and the peaceful silence made him feel at home. Most nights he worked alone at a small desk near the history section, helping students find books or shelving returns. But since the story about the trick question had spread, a few students started stopping by his desk to ask about it. "Did you really say that thing about truth not bending?" One girl asked one evening. She looked both curious and impressed. Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Something like that," he said. "That was amazing," she said. "I wish I could think like that." He shook his head gently. "You already can. You just have to stop thinking about what everyone else expects you to say." The girl smiled and thanked him before walking away. Ethan returned to his books, a small warmth in his chest. Later that night, when the library was nearly empty, Ethan took out his notebook. He began writing small reflections, thoughts about the professor, his classmates, and the strange way people judged others by how loudly they spoke. He wrote, "People often mistake silence for weakness, but silence listens to things words cannot hear." He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, thinking about how much had changed in just a few days. He still felt like the same person, but the world around him seemed to see him differently. And maybe he thought that was what truth really did. It quietly changed people without forcing them. Meanwhile, Professor Raymond was also having his own thoughts. Late at night, he sat in his office surrounded by stacks of papers and books. The lamp on his desk cast a soft glow on his lined face. He wasn't grading papers. He was rereading old lecture notes, some from decades ago. On one of the yellowed pages, he had written the same question Ethan had answered. "If truth can be bent by belief, is it still truth?" He smiled as he remembered how sure he had been back then that no student would ever give him an answer worth keeping. But Ethan had changed that. His simple explanation had cut through years of complicated theories. It had reminded him that teaching wasn't just about sharing knowledge. It was about discovering it together. The next morning, the professor walked into class carrying a new kind of energy. He looked around the room and said, "Today, we're not here to prove who's right. We're here to explore what's real." The students seemed surprised, but they liked this new tone. The room felt warmer, more open. The professor invited everyone to share ideas freely without fear of being wrong. Ethan noticed how different it felt. It wasn't a competition anymore. It was a conversation. At one point, the professor turned toward Ethan and asked, "Would you like to share your thoughts on this, Ethan?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He spoke softly but clearly, explaining how he saw connections between small truths in everyday life and the larger truths people often ignored. The class listened closely, not because he was famous now, but because his words had a calm honesty that made sense. When he finished, the professor said, "That's exactly the kind of insight we should all aim for. Thank you." After class, a few students gathered around Ethan asking questions or sharing their opinions. It felt strange but good. He wasn't invisible anymore. Still, he didn't let it go to his head. He knew attention could fade as quickly as it came. Weeks passed and finals approached. The stress across campus grew heavy. Students filled the library until midnight. their tired faces buried in notes. Ethan stayed busy helping out and studying when he could. Sometimes he thought about the professor's challenge again and wondered if there would be another surprise question in the final exam. On the last day of class, Professor Raymond stood before them one more time. He said, "I've taught here for 30 years and I've seen thousands of answers, but only a few made me question my own beliefs. Remember this, education isn't about collecting facts. It's about learning how to think without fear." He paused and smiled slightly. "And sometimes the quietest student teaches the loudest lesson." The class clapped softly, not sure if it was a farewell or a compliment meant for someone specific. Ethan lowered his eyes, feeling a small blush rise on his cheeks. After the exam, when everyone was leaving, the professor stopped Ethan at the door. "You reminded me why I became a teacher," he said kindly. "Don't let the world silence that mind of yours." Ethan smiled. "Thank you, sir. I'll try not to." Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall again, soft and white. The campus looked peaceful under the dim streetlights. Ethan walked slowly, watching the flakes land on his gloves. Each one melted as soon as it touched, leaving behind tiny drops of water, small truths that vanished too quickly to be held, but real, all the same. He thought about how truth, like snow, was quiet and pure. People might walk all over it, try to reshape it, or ignore it altogether, but it would always return, falling softly when the world needed reminding. That night, he went back to his dorm and opened his notebook again. He wrote one line before turning off the light. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It waits for the right ear. He closed the book and smiled. The world outside was still noisy, full of voices trying to be louder than one another. But Ethan had learned something priceless. Silence, when filled with understanding, was more powerful than any argument. He turned off the lamp and looked out the window at the snow still falling under the yellow glow of the streetlight. Somewhere he imagined the professor was also awake, thinking about that same simple question that had started it all. And in that quiet, shared thought between teacher and student, truth remained, unchanged, patient, and waiting to be seen. Years passed, but the memory of that day in the Harvard lecture hall never faded from Ethan's mind. It wasn't just another class or just another question. It had become a turning point, the moment when he realized that true understanding didn't need noise and that silence could hold more power than 1,000 clever words. After graduation, life moved quickly. Some of his classmates went into big companies, some into law, some into politics. Ethan chose a quieter path. He became a researcher, someone who spent most of his days surrounded by books and ideas instead of crowds. He worked in a small university on the outskirts of the city, teaching philosophy to young students who reminded him of himself. Curious, shy, and searching for meaning in a busy world. He never tried to be famous. He never sought attention. But his way of teaching slowly began to attract notice. He had a special way of speaking, calm, thoughtful, and full of patience. His students often said that in his classes, they didn't feel pressured to prove themselves. Instead, they felt seen, heard, and understood. One winter afternoon after his lecture ended, Ethan sat in his office reading essays from his students. Outside, the trees were covered in snow and the world seemed peaceful. His phone buzzed with a new email. He almost ignored it until he saw the sender's name, Professor Raymond. His heart skipped. It had been years since he'd last seen or spoken to him. He quickly opened the message. "Dear Ethan," it began, "I've been following your work from afar. It brings me great pride to see the quiet student who once answered a simple question, now guiding others to ask their own. Your words about truth have stayed with me. I have retired now, but I still think about that day often. Perhaps the teacher was the one who truly learned that morning. With respect, Raymond." Weeks later, he received another letter, this time not an email but an envelope with a Harvard seal. Inside was a handwritten note from Professor Raymond's family. It said the professor had passed away peacefully, surrounded by family and books. The note mentioned that among his personal belongings they found a small frame on his desk containing a slip of paper with a single sentence written in faded ink. "Truth doesn't bend." "We do." Ethan stared at those words for a long time. His eyes grew wet, but he smiled softly. That one line, the line he had spoken as a nervous student, had stayed with the man who once tried to trick him. It had become a part of the teacher's legacy, just as it had become a part of Ethan's. That evening, Ethan went for a walk across the snowy campus where he now taught. The sound of footsteps crunching against the snow reminded him of the old Harvard pathways. He stopped near a bench and looked up at the night sky. The stars glimmered faintly through the cold air, timeless and unmoved, just like truth itself. He thought about his students and how, one day, they too would leave and find their own questions to answer. He hoped they would remember the same lesson he had learned long ago, that knowledge means nothing without humility, and silence can often reveal what noise hides. Months passed, and the new semester began. Ethan's classes filled up faster than ever before. One day, a new student lingered after class, nervously holding a notebook. "Professor," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" Ethan smiled. Of course, she hesitated. "Why do you always say that questions are more important than answers?" Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "Because answers end the conversation, but questions keep it alive. Truth grows in conversation, not in silence, but not in noise either. It grows in honest curiosity." The girl nodded slowly. "That makes sense," she said. "I want to learn to think like that." Ethan smiled gently. "Then start by listening more than you speak. That's where truth begins." The student left the room smiling, and Ethan felt something warm in his chest. The same feeling he'd had years ago when his professor had looked at him with quiet respect. That night, he stayed late in his office writing notes for his next lecture. The world outside was quiet, only the faint hum of the heater breaking the silence. He paused for a moment and looked at the framed photo on his desk. It was of him and Professor Raymond, taken years ago during his graduation. Beneath it, he kept that same handwritten quote from the letter, "Truth doesn't bend. We do." He whispered softly to himself, "You were the first to teach me that, sir." The next morning, as the sun rose over the campus, Ethan walked into his lecture hall. The students were waiting, chatting softly. He placed his notebook on the desk and looked at them with a calm smile. "Today," he said, "I want to try something different." The class laughed lightly, remembering how he always started his lessons that way. "No trick questions this time," he added, smiling. "But I do have one for you to think about. If silence could speak, what would it tell us about truth?" The room went still. Students began writing, thinking deeply. Ethan watched them, a faint glimmer in his eyes. He saw himself in them, the same uncertainty, the same hunger for understanding. One student raised his hand. "Professor, what's your answer to that question?" Ethan chuckled softly. "If I gave you my answer, you'd stop looking for yours. The real lesson is in the search." The students smiled and went back to their notes. The room filled with quiet thought. Ethan walked slowly across the rows, his mind drifting between past and present. In that moment, he felt that Professor Raymond was still there somehow, not in body, but in the spirit of every curious mind in that room. The torch had passed, and it burned quietly but brightly. Later that day, as he walked home, he stopped by the university garden. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold. A group of students passed by, laughing and talking, their voices echoing in the cold air. Ethan smiled as he watched them go. He thought about how people come and go, how lessons outlive the teachers who speak them, and how truth, though quiet, always finds its way through the noise of the world. He took out his notebook and wrote a final reflection for the day. Truth doesn't need an audience. It only needs an honest mind to see it. He closed the notebook gently and slipped it into his bag. Then he stood there for a while, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the old buildings. The wind brushed softly against his face and he felt peaceful, not because he had found all the answers, but because he had learned how to keep asking the right questions. As he walked away, his footsteps faded into the soft snow, just like the professors had years before. 2 lives, 2 generations connected by one simple idea. That truth, no matter how deeply hidden or quietly spoken, always remains, and somewhere beyond sound or time. That old voice seemed to whisper again, proud and gentle, "That's correct." Years later, long after the snowy winter when Ethan had received that final letter from Professor Raymond, the quiet boy who once sat at the back of a Harvard classroom had become something entirely unexpected. He was no longer just a teacher or a researcher. He had become a mentor to many, a calm and steady presence in a noisy academic world. His small lectures had turned into workshops and then into conferences. People from different universities invited him to speak, not because he was famous, but because of the way he made complicated ideas feel simple and deeply human. Still, Ethan never changed his way. He didn't use big words or grand gestures. He always spoke softly, choosing each word carefully, giving space for silence between thoughts. Those moments of silence made people lean in closer, waiting for the next line. He had learned that wisdom didn't come from filling the air, but from respecting it. One evening, Ethan was invited to give a talk at Harvard again. It had been almost 20 years since he'd last walked through those gates as a student. The university had changed. New buildings, new faces, brighter screens and faster lives. But the heart of it, the quiet beauty of learning, was still there. He walked through the old stone paths leading to the lecture hall where his life had changed. The wooden benches had been replaced with new ones, but the same tall windows still let in the golden evening light. Standing at the front of the hall, Ethan could almost see the younger version of himself sitting in the last row, nervous, unsure, waiting for a moment that would change everything. As students filled the room for his talk, the sound of their laughter and chatter filled the air. Ethan stood quietly by the podium, looking at them with a warm smile. When the room settled, he began in his calm, steady voice. "Many years ago, I sat in this very room," he said, "not as a teacher, but as a student who was too afraid to speak. I thought silence meant weakness. I thought I needed to sound smart to be respected. But one day a professor asked a question that no one could answer, and in that silence I found my voice." The room grew still. A few students leaned forward, curious. Ethan continued, "That day taught me something I've carried with me ever since, that truth doesn't need to shout. It doesn't bend because of what we believe. It simply waits for us to see it." He paused for a moment, looking around. The young faces staring back at him reminded him of himself and his classmates, full of dreams and fears, all wanting to be seen, to matter, to understand. He told them the story exactly as it had happened. The question, the noise of debate, the professor's quiet smile when he finally spoke. He didn't dramatize it. He simply told it as a memory, raw and honest. And when he reached the part where the professor said, "That's correct," the students broke into gentle applause. Ethan smiled softly and said, "But here's the part most people forget. The real lesson that day wasn't that I had the right answer. It was that the professor had the humility to listen to it. Truth isn't owned by the one who speaks it or the one who hears it. It's something that connects both." When the talk ended, students surrounded him, asking questions, shaking his hand, taking notes. But what touched him most was one young boy who stayed behind after everyone left. He looked nervous, holding a small notebook just like Ethan once had. "Sir," the boy said quietly, "I wanted to thank you. I don't talk much in class either. Sometimes people think I'm not paying attention, but I just think slower, I guess." Ethan smiled, recognizing the familiar uncertainty in the boy's voice. "Thinking slowly doesn't mean thinking less," he said kindly. "It means you're giving ideas the time they deserve." The boy nodded, eyes lighting up. "My professors always say I need to speak up more." Ethan chuckled softly. "Speak when you have something worth saying. Silence is not your enemy, or it's your tool. It gives weight to your words when you finally use them." The boy smiled and thanked him again before leaving. Ethan stood there alone for a while after that, the empty hall echoing faintly with the sounds of footsteps fading down the corridor. It was as if time itself had folded, bringing his own past and the boy's future together in one quiet moment. As he turned to leave, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Hanging near the entrance was a framed plaque, newly placed on the wall. It had a title engraved at the top, "Lessons in Humility." Beneath it was a quote written in elegant letters, "Truth doesn't bend." "We do," and under that line it said, "In memory of Professor Raymond, whose questions made generations think." Ethan froze for a moment, emotion washing over him. His throat tightened. He reached out and gently touched the glass frame. The quote looked just as it had when the professor had written it years ago. He realized then that the line had come full circle. It had started as a student's answer, become a teacher's reflection, and now stood as a lesson for everyone who walked those halls. That night, Ethan didn't go straight to his hotel. He walked through the old Harvard courtyard, where snow had started to fall again, just like it had all those years ago. The flakes landed softly on his coat and hair, He stopped near the bench where he used to sit as a student, thinking about life and all its questions. He whispered softly, "Thank you, Professor. You were right. The trick was never about finding the answer. It was about finding ourselves." A soft wind blew through the trees, and in that quiet, Ethan felt something peaceful, as if the professor was still there, somewhere in that night air, proud and smiling. Years continued to pass, and Ethan grew older. His hair turned gray, his step slower, but his eyes still carried the same calm light. When people asked him what the most important lesson he had ever learned was, he always gave the same answer: that truth doesn't change, and only how we see it does. In his final years, Ethan began writing a book. It wasn't about philosophy or theories. It was about people, about how real understanding often came from small, ordinary moments. A conversation, a pause, a question that lingered. The title of the book was simple: The Quiet Mind. When it was finally published, it touched readers around the world. Many said it made them rethink how they spoke, how they listened, and how they understood truth. Some even said it helped them make peace with their own silence. On the day of the book's release, Ethan sat by his window, watching the rain fall gently outside. He didn't crave reviews or fame. He simply felt thankful that the words he once hesitated to speak had found a way to reach so many others. He looked at the framed quote on his desk one last time, the same one that had followed him through his entire journey. The ink had faded, but the meaning never had. Truth doesn't bend, we do. He smiled softly, whispering, "And that's still correct." In that peaceful moment, Ethan closed his notebook. The world outside kept moving. Students hurrying to classes, buses rushing by, people chasing their own answers. But somewhere in the heart of that movement, there was still space for silence. A silence that held understanding, patience, and truth. And just like that day long ago in a crowded lecture hall, the quiet boy who once spoke a few honest words had left behind something lasting. Not noise, not fame, but clarity. A reminder that even in a world full of voices, the truest wisdom often comes from the quietest one. Many years passed after Ethan's book, The Quiet Mind, had spread quietly across the world. It was the kind of book people discovered by accident, at an airport shelf in an old library, or on a friend's desk, and once they started reading, it stayed with them. It didn't promise success or miracles. It simply reminded people to pause, to listen, and to think clearly before speaking. Ethan had never imagined that his words would travel so far. He didn't have social media, didn't do interviews, and rarely appeared in public. Yet somehow, letters kept arriving at his doorstep from people who said his words helped them find calm in a noisy world. Students, doctors, parents, even prisoners, all writing to say thank you. He read each one carefully, smiling at how the world still cared about quietness in an age that seemed to celebrate noise. But among all the letters, one stood out. It came from a young woman who was studying philosophy at Harvard. Her name was Lily. In her letter, she wrote, "Dear Mr. Ethan, I attended your lecture once when I was a first-year student. I was too shy to speak to you then, but that day changed me. You said silence is not weakness, it's understanding and progress. I wrote that line in my notebook, and it has guided me through every difficult moment since. I wanted to thank you, and also to tell you that I'm now teaching at the same university where you once sat as a student." Ethan read the letter twice, his eyes softening with quiet pride. It felt like life had drawn another circle, bringing everything back to where it began. Months later, he received an invitation from Harvard again. They wanted to name a small seminar room after him, the Ethan Clark Room, dedicated to the art of thoughtful learning. Ethan hesitated at first. He didn't see himself as someone who deserved a name on a wall, but Lily's letter gave him the courage to accept. When he arrived at the ceremony, the hall was full. Professors, students, alumni, and even a few of his old classmates who had come to see him after decades. The air was filled with warmth and respect, not the formal kind, but the gentle kind that comes from gratitude. Lily was there too, standing by the stage. She smiled when she saw him and said softly, "It's an honor to meet you again, sir. I was one of those students who used to sit in the back just like you once did." Ethan chuckled. "Then you already know the secret," he said. The best seats aren't always at the front. When he was invited to speak, he didn't use notes or a script. He simply looked at the young faces in the crowd and began with a small story. Not about achievements, but about the day a professor once tried to test his students with a question no one could answer. He described the silence in the room, the uncertainty, and how a single honest thought changed everything. The students listened in complete stillness. Some had heard the story before, but hearing it from the man himself made it real in a way that words on paper never could. When Ethan finished, he looked at Lily and said, "When I was your age, I thought learning was about knowing everything. Now I realize it's about staying open, even when you think you already know." The audience applauded gently, not out of excitement, but out of deep respect, and as they unveiled the small plaque with his name, Ethan felt a quiet peace settle over him. It wasn't pride or glory, it was contentment, the kind that comes from knowing your life has meant something true. After the ceremony, Lily walked with him through the courtyard. The air smelled of spring, fresh grass and blooming flowers. Students were scattered around with books, laughing, talking, dreaming. "Do you ever miss teaching?" Lily asked. Ethan smiled. "I never stopped," he replied. "Every person you speak truth to, you're teaching. Every time you listen with patience, you're still learning." "The classroom just changes shape." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I tell my students too," she said quietly. "I think they listen to me because of your book." Ethan looked at her kindly. "Then maybe the story never really ends," he said. "It just keeps finding new voices." They walked in silence for a while, the evening sun stretching long shadows across the path. Ethan's steps were slower now, his body older, but his spirit still carried the calm confidence of the boy who once answered a trick question with truth. When he finally returned home that night, he placed Lily's letter beside his old notebook, the one that still held the faded notes from his student days. He ran his hand over the worn pages and smiled. That night he wrote a final entry, just a few simple lines. "Every question hides another question. Every silence hides another truth. To the next quiet mind, listen deeply, speak gently, and the world will hear you." Not long after, Ethan passed away peacefully in his sleep. There were no grand headlines or breaking news, just a soft ripple of sadness across the academic world. But in classrooms, libraries, and study rooms everywhere, people picked up the quiet mind again. They underlined his words, shared his lessons, and whispered his favorite line, "Truth doesn't bend." We do. At Harvard, Lily continued teaching. She often began her lectures with Ethan's story, the quiet boy, the tricky question, and the moment that changed everything. Her students listened, captivated, and every time she spoke his name, she smiled. One afternoon, years later, she found a student waiting outside her office door. He was nervous, holding a notebook close to his chest. "Professor," he said, "I read that book you told us about, The Quiet Mind. I think I finally understand what it means. It's not about being silent, is it? It's about being honest." Lily smiled warmly. "Exactly," she said. "Silence isn't the absence of sound, and it's the space where truth grows." The boy nodded slowly, the way Ethan once had all those years ago. And as Lily watched him walk away, she felt it again, that same quiet circle of life continuing just as Ethan had said it would. The story hadn't ended with him. It was alive in every thoughtful student, in every teacher who paused before speaking, in every person who dared to listen a little deeper, somewhere beyond time. Maybe Ethan and Professor Raymond were smiling too, proud of how far a single moment of truth had traveled. From a classroom trick to a lifelong lesson, from one quiet boy to a world learning to listen. And so the story lived on, softly, endlessly, truthfully, carried by those who believed that sometimes the most powerful voices are the quietest ones. Years passed quietly after Ethan's death. Seasons came and went, yet his story never faded. At Harvard, his name became a gentle memory, not carved in stone, but carried in the hearts of those who understood what his life had stood for. His lessons were not about equations or definitions. They were about clarity, patience, and the courage to think for yourself, even when the world demanded quick answers. The small seminar room named after him became a special place on campus. Students often came there not to attend lectures, but to sit, reflect, or simply read in silence. On one wall beside his photograph hung a framed page from The Quiet Mind, with the famous line written beneath it. "Truth doesn't bend. We do." Every year during orientation week, professors brought new students to that room. They would tell the story of Ethan Clark, the quiet student who once surprised his professor by answering a question no one else could. They explained how that one moment had grown into a lifelong philosophy about learning and humility. But beyond Harvard, Ethan's story continued to ripple in ways even he could never have imagined. In classrooms across the world, teachers quoted his words to remind their students that silence was not weakness. In hospitals, therapists used his story to teach patience and empathy. And in homes, parents read The Quiet Mind to their children before bed, not as a lesson, but as a reminder that wisdom begins with listening. One day, many years later, a documentary team visited Harvard to record a film about influential educators who had changed modern teaching. They included Ethan's story, interviewing people who had known him, including Lily. By then, she was a respected professor herself, known for her calm and thoughtful teaching style, much like Ethan's. As cameras rolled, the interviewer asked her, "What do you think made Ethan Clark so special?" Lily paused for a long moment before answering. "He made thinking feel sacred," she said softly. "He taught us that knowledge isn't about showing off how much you know. It's about understanding deeply and respecting what you don't. He never chased recognition, and that's exactly why he's remembered." The interviewer nodded, touched by her words. Then he asked, "Do you think his way of teaching still fits in today's fast world?" Lily smiled faintly. "More than ever," she said. "We're surrounded by noise now. Everyone wants to speak first, prove they're right, argue louder. But Ethan reminded us that truth doesn't compete. It just waits for the right listener." When the documentary was released, it spread far and wide. People shared clips of Ethan's story on social media, and once again, his simple message reached new generations. Teachers started quiet classes, where students spent part of each lesson reflecting silently before discussions. Some schools even created Ethan Days, one day each year dedicated to thoughtful listening and honest discussion. And yet, despite all the fame that came after, Ethan's story always felt humble, like it belonged to everyone, not just one man. It was the story of every person who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unsure, a reminder that even the quietest among us could change the way the world thinks. Years later, a young boy named Noah walked into the Ethan Clark room for the first time. He was a freshman, shy and uncertain, the kind of student who preferred the back seat. His professors often encouraged him to speak up more, but he didn't like forcing words. That day, he found the small plaque on the wall and began to read Ethan's story. When he finished, he sat there for a while, feeling something stir inside him, a strange mixture of peace and inspiration. He whispered softly, "Maybe it's okay to be quiet." He began coming to that room often, especially when classes felt overwhelming. Sometimes he would just sit there and write his thoughts the way Ethan once did. One evening, while sitting there alone, he noticed a small notebook tucked between the books on the shelf. The first page was old and yellowed, but the handwriting was clear. It read, "To whoever finds this, keep listening. The world will always try to rush you. Don't let it. Truth speaks softly. Learn to hear it." Noah didn't know whose handwriting it was, maybe Ethan's, maybe Lily's, but it didn't matter. He copied the line into his own notebook and smiled. Over time, Noah grew into a confident student, though never loud. He began to lead small study groups, guiding others with patience and kindness. His calm way of thinking made people trust him. Professors noticed how he listened deeply before speaking, how he never rushed to answer, and how his words always carried meaning when he finally did. On his graduation day, when Noah received his degree, he walked one last time to the Ethan Clark room. He stood in front of the plaque, touched it gently and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the wind rustled the leaves just enough to sound like a soft reply. Years later, Noah became a teacher himself. He never forgot that small room or the story of the quiet boy who once spoke the truth. Every semester, on the first day of class, he told Ethan's story to his students. Not to make them memorize it, but to help them understand that real wisdom didn't always come from being the first to speak. Sometimes it came from having the patience to listen. And in that way, the story continued, passed down not through textbooks or lectures, but through hearts and minds that believed in it. It was never about a professor's trick or a perfect answer. It was about something deeper, a connection between teacher and student, between silence and understanding, between truth and humility. Long after Ethan's name faded from the news, his spirit stayed alive in those who carried his message forward. In every classroom where a quiet student raised their hand for the first time, in every thoughtful pause before a conversation, and in every heart that chose truth over noise, his voice still echoed softly, a quiet reminder that the world doesn't always belong to the loudest, but often to the calmest, and somewhere in the gentle stillness between words, his legacy whispered once more, "Truth doesn't bend. We do."